After my stepfather called me worthless garbage, my mother said, "You should have shown him more respect." She was standing right there when he screamed it in my face with spit flying because I'd forgotten to take out the trash before school, and she just nodded along like he was giving reasonable feedback. If you acted like a proper daughter instead of an ungrateful brat, Gerald wouldn't have to raise his voice. She rubbed his shoulder while he was still red-faced from calling me names I wouldn't repeat. I was 16 and had lived with this for 3 years since she married Gerald, who believed children should be silent and invisible. I said good morning to him. That's all I did wrong. My mother sighed like I was exhausting her. You said it wrong. Your tone was disrespectful. Gerald deserves better from you after everything he's done for us. Everything he'd done was move into our house that my dead father had paid off and demand we follow his rules. He called me worthless garbage because I had a tone. Gerald stepped closer and I could smell the coffee on his breath. You are worthless until you learn respect. Your mother agrees. My mother nodded immediately. Gerald knows about respect. He was in the military. You could learn from him if you'd stop being so difficult. Gerald had been discharged from the military after 6 months for insubordination, but they told everyone he was a veteran like he'd served for years. I have homework. I tried to leave, but Gerald blocked the doorway. You leave when I say you can leave. This is my house. It wasn't his house, but my mother had added his name to the deed without telling me. Apologize to Gerald for your attitude this morning and for talking back just now. My mother's voice was cold. I didn't do anything wrong. That's when Gerald really started screaming, called me every name you could think of while my mother stood there. You're stupid. You're pathetic. You're a waste of space. No wonder you have no friends. I did have friends but wasn't allowed to see them because Gerald said teenagers were bad influences. You'll never amount to anything. You're just like your deadbeat father. My father had been a teacher who died of cancer, but Gerald had convinced my mother he'd been weak. My mother touched Gerald's arm gently. She's still learning, honey. Remember, she didn't have proper male guidance until you came along. I looked at my mother. He's calling me names and you're comforting him? She turned on me fast. You provoke him. Every morning you provoke him with your sulking and your attitude. If you smiled and showed gratitude, none of this would happen. I hadn't sulked. I'd walked into the kitchen for breakfast. He starts yelling the second he sees me. My mother shook her head. Because you radiate negativity. Gerald is sensitive to energy and yours is hostile. Gerald smirked behind her. Your mother understands respect. You should be more like her. My mother preened at the compliment while I stood there shaking. This happened every day. He'd scream at me for breathing wrong and she'd blame me for making him do it. Can I go to school now? Gerald laughed. School? You're too stupid for school. You should drop out and get a job. Start contributing instead of leeching. I was a straight A student, but my mother had stopped coming to parent-teacher conferences because Gerald said they were pointless. Let her go to school, Gerald. Maybe she'll learn some manners there. My mother opened the door for me. As I walked past, she whispered, You need to try harder. Gerald is the best thing that happened to us. At school, my English teacher, Mrs. Coleman, noticed I was upset. What's wrong? I started crying and told her everything. How Gerald screamed at me daily. How my mother blamed me for it. How I wasn't allowed to exist in my own home without being called names. Mrs. Coleman's face got very serious. This is abuse. Verbal and emotional abuse. Your mother enabling it is abuse too. She took me to the counselor who called child services. They said unless there was physical violence, they couldn't do much, but they'd investigate. That night, my mother was furious. You told people our private business? You tried to destroy our family? Gerald was behind her smiling. I told you she was poison. She wants to ruin our happiness. My mother agreed. We're moving you to the basement. Gerald shouldn't have to see you if you're going to cause problems. The basement was unfinished concrete with no heat. That's illegal. The counselor said I have to have a proper room. Gerald laughed. Then you can leave. Go live with your precious counselor. My mother pulled out a suitcase. Choose, basement or streets. I chose neither. I called my father's sister who lived 2 states away. Aunt Linda had been trying to contact me for years, but my mother had blocked her saying she was toxic. Get me out of here, please. Aunt Linda drove through the night. When she arrived the next morning, my mother wouldn't let her in. This is my house. Leave or I'll call the police. Aunt Linda stood on the porch while my mother blocked the screen door with her body. Gerald was behind her with his arms crossed and that smirk on his face like he was watching a show. I sat frozen halfway down the stairs listening to everything. My mother's voice was sharp when she spoke through the screen. She said this was family business and Aunt Linda had no right to interfere. Aunt Linda's voice stayed calm, but I could hear something hard underneath it. She said she wasn't leaving without talking to me and that she'd been trying to reach me for 2 years. My mother laughed like that was ridiculous. She said I was fine and Aunt Linda was making problems where none existed. Gerald leaned forward and said something quiet that I couldn't hear. but it made my mother nod. She told Aunt Linda to leave or she'd call the police. Aunt Linda pulled out her phone right there on the porch. She said that was a good idea and they should call together. My mother's face changed for just a second before she caught herself. She looked back at Gerald and he wasn't smirking anymore. The police showed up in less than 20 minutes. I heard the car pull up and watched through the window as 2 officers got out and walked up to the porch. My mother opened the door then, and suddenly she was all pleasant and confused about why Aunt Linda was causing a scene. Gerald stood next to her playing the concerned stepfather role. One of the officers asked if they could come inside to sort this out. My mother hesitated but then stepped back and let everyone in. I stayed on the stairs while they all stood in the living room. The officer looked at me and asked directly if I wanted to leave with my aunt. His voice was neutral, but his eyes were kind. I opened my mouth but nothing came out at first. My mother jumped in before I could speak. She said of course I could visit with Aunt Linda, but she just wanted to make sure it was safe and supervised. Her voice was so reasonable and motherly that I almost wondered if I'd imagined everything that happened this morning. Gerald stayed quiet during all of this, which was somehow worse than his screaming. The officer explained that at 16, I could express a preference about where I stayed, but my mother had legal custody, so it was complicated. I watched my mother's face shift from worried to calculated as she realized she needed to look like the reasonable parent. She told the officer that she had no problem with me spending time with Aunt Linda. She just wanted what was best for me. The officer asked me again what I wanted. I looked at Aunt Linda and then at my mother and Gerald. I said I wanted to have lunch with Aunt Linda. Just lunch. My mother smiled and said that sounded lovely. The officer made notes and asked Aunt Linda where she was staying. She gave him the hotel name on Route 9. He said that was fine and told my mother and Gerald that this was a voluntary visit. As Aunt Linda and I walked toward the door, my mother leaned close and whispered that I better not embarrass this family. The familiar guilt rose up in my chest like water filling my lungs. Aunt Linda drove us to a restaurant about 15 minutes away from the house. She ordered food, but I was too nervous to eat anything. My stomach felt twisted up tight. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said we had time and I didn't have to rush. Then she pulled out a folder from her bag. Inside were papers with official-looking headers and numbers. She spread them out on the table between our plates. She showed me documents about my father's estate and bank statements and the original house deed. The deed only had my parents' names on it, not Gerald's. She explained that my mother adding Gerald's name might be legal, but there was something else. Life insurance money that my father had left specifically for my education. It should have been in an account, but it wasn't there anymore. The money had disappeared. I started crying right there in the middle of the restaurant. Other people were eating and talking, and I was crying because I didn't even know that money existed. Aunt Linda reached across and held my hand tighter. She said she'd been trying to get information for 2 years, but my mother blocked everything. She pulled out her phone and showed me her call log. Dozens of attempts. She showed me returned letters that my mother had sent back unopened. I realized how completely I'd been cut off from my father's entire family. Aunt Linda said my mother told everyone I didn't want contact, that I was angry and needed space. None of it was true. She kept talking and showing me more documents. She said the house was paid off when my dad died. He'd worked extra jobs to make sure we'd always have a home. And now Gerald's name was on the deed like he owned it. She asked if I knew how that happened. I shook my head. I didn't know anything. My mother never told me about any of this. Aunt Linda said that was part of the problem. I was being kept in the dark about my own life, about my own father's wishes for me. 3 hours passed before Aunt Linda drove me back to the house. My mother was waiting at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She thanked Aunt Linda for the nice visit while Gerald watched from the living room window. My mother said I had homework to do and school tomorrow. She was making it clear this was a one-time thing. Aunt Linda walked me to the door, and before I went inside, she pressed something small into my hand. A phone. She whispered that I should call her any time and that she was staying at the hotel on Route 9. I slipped the phone into my backpack fast before my mother could see. I walked into the house feeling like I had a secret lifeline for the first time in 3 years. My mother closed the door and her fake smile dropped immediately. She asked what we talked about. I said just normal family stuff. Her eyes got narrow and suspicious. She asked what kind of normal family stuff. I said we talked about school and she told me stories about Dad. My mother made a sound in her throat. She said Aunt Linda probably filled my head with lies about Gerald. I said no. She stared at me for a long moment and then told me to go do my homework. I went upstairs to my room and hid the phone under my mattress. My hands were shaking. That night, Gerald came to my room. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and stood there blocking the exit. His voice was low and controlled when he spoke. He said I'd made a big mistake involving outsiders and family business. He wasn't yelling, which made it worse somehow. He explained very clearly that if I kept causing problems, they would make my life so miserable I'd beg to leave on my own. My mother appeared behind him in the doorway. She didn't tell him to stop or leave me alone. She just nodded along with everything he said. She added that Aunt Linda was trying to poison me against them. She said I needed to be smart about who I trusted. Gerald said they were taking my laptop. He said I'd lost computer privileges because I couldn't be trusted. My mother unplugged it from my desk and carried it out. They both left and closed the door. I lay in bed that night clutching the hidden phone under my pillow. I was too scared to turn it on in case they somehow knew about it. I could hear them talking downstairs but couldn't make out the words, just the tone, planning something. I went straight to Mrs. Coleman's classroom before school started the next morning. She was at her desk grading papers. I closed the door behind me and told her everything that happened. About Aunt Linda and the police and the documents about the missing insurance money. Mrs. Coleman stopped grading and took out a notebook. She wrote down everything I said with dates and details. Then she stood up and said we were going to the principal's office. Hannah Tanner was already there when we arrived. The counselor's face got serious when Mrs. Coleman explained about the financial information. Hannah said this changed things because it suggested exploitation, not just emotional abuse. They helped me write down everything I could remember. Every detail about the money and the house deed and Gerald's threats last night. Mrs. Coleman said she would keep all the documentation at the school so my mother and Gerald couldn't find it. The principal made copies of everything. He said he was calling CPS again with the updated information. This felt different from the first time. The adults were actually taking it seriously, instead of just checking boxes and moving on. Hannah Tanner called the CPS caseworker that same day. His name was Grayson King. He came to the school that afternoon during my lunch period. They set us up in a private office away from other students. Grayson asked detailed questions about the financial situation and Gerald's control tactics. I told him about the basement threat, and the isolation from friends and the constant verbal abuse. I told him how my mother enabled everything and blamed me for Gerald's behavior. He wrote it all down without the dismissive attitude from the first report. He said financial exploitation combined with emotional abuse created a stronger case, especially since I was 16 and could clearly explain what was happening. Grayson said he'd do a home visit within 48 hours. He said he'd be looking specifically for evidence of the controlling environment I described. I felt hope and terror mixed together. Hope that someone was finally listening. Terror about what Gerald would do when CPS showed up at the house again. During lunch, I locked myself in a bathroom stall and called Aunt Linda on the prepaid phone. She answered on the second ring. She said she'd been researching Gerald's military record through a friend who worked at the VA. She'd found documentation that he was discharged after only 6 months, not for medical reasons like he always claimed, for repeated insubordination and failure to follow orders. She said this proved he'd been lying about his veteran status for years. It mattered because it showed a pattern of dishonesty. It also explained why he was so obsessed with control and respect at home. He couldn't handle actual military structure, so he created his own dictatorship in our house. Aunt Linda said she was sending copies of the discharge papers to Grayson King. She said this kind of documentation helped build the bigger picture of who Gerald really was versus who he pretended to be. I thanked her and hung up before anyone could hear me talking. I washed my face in the sink and went to my next class. That evening, my mother came to my room alone. She sat on my bed with tears in her eyes. Her voice was soft when she spoke. She said she knew things had been hard, but Gerald really did care about our family in his own way. She took my hand and said she understood I missed my father. She asked if I remembered how scared she was trying to manage everything alone after Dad died. The familiar guilt came flooding back because she was right. She had been struggling. She said Aunt Linda was trying to break up our family because she never approved of Gerald. My mother said if I just tried harder to show respect and follow the rules, then Gerald would calm down. We could be happy again. For a moment, I almost believed her because I wanted so badly for this to be fixable. Then she added that if I kept causing problems with CPS and lawyers, I would destroy any chance we had at being a normal family. That's when I realized she wasn't actually apologizing. She was manipulating me into silence. I pulled my hand away. I said I didn't think things would get better. Her face changed from sad to angry in a second. She stood up and left without saying anything else. 2 days later, Grayson King showed up with another CPS worker. I stayed in my room, but I could hear everything. Gerald put on his reasonable veteran act. He showed them around the clean house. He explained that teenagers exaggerate normal discipline. My mother backed him up perfectly. She described me as a difficult child who'd been acting out since my father died. She made it sound like grief-driven rebellion rather than response to abuse. But then Grayson asked to see the basement where they'd threatened to move me. I heard Gerald's voice get tight. He said it was just unfinished storage space, not suitable for a bedroom, which contradicted their threat completely. The CPS workers came upstairs and knocked on my door. They interviewed me separately while Gerald and my mother waited downstairs. I told them about my mother's manipulation attempt 2 nights ago, about the missing education fund, about Gerald's escalating control and the threats. Grayson wrote everything down. When they were done, he said quietly that he believed me. He said he was building a case, but these things took time. They left, and I heard my mother and Gerald arguing downstairs after the door closed. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. They were angry. Over the next few days, Gerald stopped screaming, but that made it worse somehow. He followed me from room to room without saying anything, just watching. I'd be doing homework at the kitchen table, and he'd stand in the doorway staring at me. I'd go upstairs and hear his footsteps behind me on the stairs. He never got close enough to touch me, but he was always there. My stuff started moving too. I'd leave my backpack on my bed and find it in the bathroom. My textbooks would disappear from my desk and turn up in the laundry room. When I asked about it, Gerald smiled and said he was organizing, making the house more efficient. My mother acted like she didn't notice any of it. She kept bringing up the CPS visit, saying I'd embarrassed Gerald in front of strangers, that he deserved an apology for being treated like a criminal in his own home. I stopped eating dinner with them because Gerald would sit across from me and stare without blinking. The whole meal. Not eating, not talking. Just staring at me until I couldn't swallow my food. I'd wait until they went to bed and try to make something later, but Gerald had started hiding food. The bread would be gone. The peanut butter moved to some cabinet I couldn't find. I called Aunt Linda from the bathroom with the shower running so they couldn't hear. I was crying so hard I could barely talk. She said this was actually good for the case, that Gerald was showing he couldn't keep up the reasonable act when he felt challenged, but living through it felt impossible. I couldn't sleep because I kept hearing him walking around outside my door at night. At the school, Mrs. Coleman pulled me aside after class. She said I looked like I'd lost weight, asked if I was eating enough. I told her about Gerald hiding food and following me around, and she got this really serious look on her face. She said she knew someone who might be able to help. A legal aid group that worked with kids in bad situations. That afternoon during study hall, I got a call on the prepaid phone from a woman named Jimena Rodriguez. She said Mrs. Coleman had reached out and she wanted to help. That her organization provided free legal services to minors in crisis, and I qualified. She asked a lot of questions about what was happening at home. About the missing insurance money Aunt Linda had found. About Gerald's behavior patterns and my mother's enabling. She took notes while I talked and didn't interrupt or act like I was exaggerating. When I finished, she said that at 16, with documented abuse and a willing relative, I had a real chance at getting placed with Aunt Linda. She explained it would take time, though. Weeks, not days. We'd need to build a strong file of evidence. But she sounded confident in a way that made me feel less alone. Like maybe this wasn't hopeless. She scheduled a meeting for the following week with me and Aunt Linda to talk about filing petitions with family court. I hung up feeling scared, but also like something was finally moving forward. The meeting happened at Jimena's office in a building downtown. Aunt Linda drove up that morning, and we sat in this small room with papers spread everywhere. Jimena explained our options. Aunt Linda could petition for temporary custody. I could file for emancipation, or we could request a custody change based on unsafe environment. She said the custody petition was strongest because I wouldn't have to prove I could support myself financially. I had a stable relative willing to take me in. The court would consider my preferences heavily at 16, especially with all the documentation we had. We spent 2 hours going through everything. The CPS reports from both visits. The paperwork about the missing insurance money. Gerald's fake military record that Aunt Linda had gotten. The basement threat. Written statements from Mrs. Coleman and Hannah Tanner about what they'd observed. Jimena spread it all out on the table and made notes. She said we'd file the petition within the week and request an emergency hearing because of how things were getting worse at home. I felt scared sitting there looking at all that evidence of my life, but also relieved that someone was finally taking it seriously. That there was a plan. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mother and trying to understand how she became someone who'd choose Gerald over me. I remembered Aunt Linda saying something about my mother having a rough childhood. I used the prepaid phone to call her around midnight, asked her to tell me about it. Aunt Linda was quiet for a minute, then explained that my mother grew up in a house where she got blamed for her father's anger, that she'd been taught keeping the peace meant accepting bad treatment, that my dad had spent years helping her heal from that. But after he died, she fell back into old patterns. Gerald's controlling behavior probably felt familiar to her in some twisted way. Understanding that made me sad instead of just angry. I could see how my mother's own trauma made her unable to protect me. But Aunt Linda was really clear that explanation didn't equal excuse. My mother's past didn't justify her enabling Gerald's abuse. I had the right to choose safety even if she couldn't. That helped somehow. Knowing it wasn't really about me. That my mother was broken in ways I couldn't fix. Wednesday morning, Jimena filed the custody petition and the motion for emergency hearing. By Thursday afternoon, my mother got the official notice from the court. She came to my room shaking. Her face was red and she was holding the legal papers in her fist. She started yelling about how I could do this to her after everything she'd sacrificed. Gerald stood behind her in the doorway. He called me ungrateful. Said Aunt Linda had poisoned my mind. My mother cried that I was destroying our family, embarrassing her in front of the whole town. I told her I just wanted to be safe. She screamed that I was safe, that I was dramatic and spoiled, that normal discipline wasn't abuse no matter what lawyers said. For the first time, I didn't apologize, didn't try to explain. I just stood there and let her see that I wasn't backing down. Something changed in her face then. Like she finally understood I was serious about leaving. She stopped yelling and just stared at me. Then she turned and walked out. Gerald followed her, but he looked back at me from the doorway with this expression I couldn't read. Over the next 2 weeks, Gerald completely lost it. He started sending me long text messages about what would happen if I went through with the custody change. Said I'd regret betraying the family. That Aunt Linda would get tired of me and kick me out. That I was too stupid and worthless to make it without them. I saved every message and sent screenshots to Jimena. My mother forwarded me emails from relatives. Gerald had contacted them trying to turn everyone against me, calling me a liar and troublemaker. I saved those too. Jimena said Gerald's inability to control himself was giving us perfect documentation, that these threats showed exactly who he really was. Mrs. Coleman called me into her office one day and said Gerald had shown up at the school trying to get access to my records. The principal had given him a trespassing warning. Each thing that happened made me more scared, but also more certain that leaving was the only option, that staying would destroy me. The emergency custody hearing was on a cold morning in February. Family court was in this old building with high ceilings and wood everywhere. I had to sit at a table with Jimena while my mother and Gerald sat across the room with their lawyer. Judge Travis Bowman came in and everyone stood up. Then I had to testify. Jimena asked me questions and I answered them for 45 minutes. Told the whole story about the verbal abuse, the isolation, the missing insurance money, the escalating threats. Gerald's lawyer tried to make me sound like a rebellious teenager making things up. But then Jimena presented the text messages, the CPS reports, the documentation about the insurance money, Gerald's discharge papers showing he'd lied about his military service. I watched the judge's face change from neutral to concerned. Aunt Linda testified about being blocked from contact for years, about being willing to provide a stable home. Mrs. Coleman came as a witness. She described how I'd changed over the past months, how I'd lost weight and couldn't focus, how she'd seen bruises on my arms from where Gerald grabbed me. I hadn't even realized she'd noticed that. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end, the judge said he needed 2 days to review everything before making a decision. I left the courthouse feeling exhausted and terrified about what happened if I had to go back home. 2 days felt like forever. I stayed in my room as much as possible. Gerald and my mother barely spoke to me. On Friday afternoon, I was sitting in Mrs. Coleman's classroom after school when my phone rang. It was Jimena. Judge Bowman had granted temporary custody to Aunt Linda. I started crying so hard I couldn't breathe. The order said I could get my stuff from the house with police escort, that my mother had supervised visitation rights if I chose to accept them. It wasn't permanent yet. There'd be another hearing in 3 months, but it meant I didn't have to go back to that house. Didn't have to sleep another night listening for Gerald's footsteps outside my door. Jimena explained the 3-month timeline gave my mother a chance to show changed circumstances. But based on everything she'd seen, she expected the temporary custody would become permanent. I called Aunt Linda and she said she was already on her way, that we'd get my stuff tomorrow and I could start at her local high school next week. The police escort was awful. 2 officers stood in the living room while I packed. Gerald wasn't there, but my mother followed me from room to room. She was crying and begging me to change my mind, saying I was breaking her heart, destroying our family. She tried to hug me and I stepped back. The look on her face was devastated, but I couldn't let myself feel guilty anymore. This was about surviving. I packed my clothes into 2 suitcases, put my books in boxes, found my father's photos that my mother had hidden in the basement. As I was carrying the last box to the door, my mother said I'd realize someday that she was trying to protect me. I didn't know what that meant. Aunt Linda loaded everything into her car. We drove away and I watched my childhood home disappear in the side mirror. I felt grief and relief all mixed together in a way I couldn't separate. The first month at Aunt Linda's house was harder than I expected. Safety didn't automatically fix 3 years of trauma. I flinched at normal sounds, had panic attacks over small disagreements, struggled to believe this stability was real. Aunt Linda was patient. She got me set up with a therapist named Dr. Sarah, who worked with kids dealing with family trauma. Slowly, I started learning that my reactions were normal, that I wasn't broken. School was awkward because I was the new kid and didn't know anyone. I was behind in some classes. But teachers were understanding when Aunt Linda explained the situation. I had nightmares about Gerald finding me, about my mother crying. Some mornings I woke up feeling guilty for leaving her even though I knew it was the right choice. Aunt Linda never pushed me to talk, but she was always there when I needed her. We'd make dinner together and she'd tell me stories about my dad that my mother never shared. Gradually, the constant tightness in my chest started to ease just a little bit. I opened the letter from my mother during a therapy session with Dr. Sarah 2 months after moving in with Aunt Linda. The envelope had been forwarded through Jimena, and I'd been staring at it for 3 days before bringing it to my appointment. Dr. Sarah watched me unfold the single page covered in my mother's handwriting, asking if I was ready to meet with her in a supervised setting. She wrote that she missed me and wanted to work toward rebuilding our relationship. She didn't mention Gerald or apologize for anything that happened. Doctor? Sarah asked what I needed if I decided to meet her, and we spent the next hour making a list of boundaries. Gerald couldn't be present at all. We had to meet somewhere neutral with a counselor or mediator there the whole time. I could leave whenever I felt unsafe or uncomfortable. Jimena helped arrange everything, and my mother agreed to all the terms. The family counseling center had beige walls and uncomfortable chairs, and a mediator named Carol, who explained the rules before my mother arrived. When my mother walked in, she tried to hug me, but I stayed seated and she sat down across from me looking hurt. She acted like we were just catching up after a normal separation, and asked about school, and if I was making friends at Aunt Linda's place. I sat there remembering every time she blamed me for Gerald screaming and chose him over protecting me. She said she missed me and wanted me to come home. I told her clearly that I wasn't coming back while Gerald lived there and maybe not ever. My mother started crying and said I was punishing her for trying to keep our family together. I explained that protecting myself wasn't the same as punishing her. Carol, the mediator, asked my mother what she'd done to address the concerns raised in court, and my mother said she didn't think there were real concerns, just misunderstandings. We sat there for 90 minutes going in circles with my mother refusing to acknowledge what actually happened. I left feeling exhausted, but also stronger because I'd stated my boundaries out loud to her face. I told Jimena afterward that I'd do occasional supervised visits if my mother wanted them, but not regular contact until she showed real change. 4 months after moving in with Aunt Linda, I woke up without the usual tightness in my chest and realized things felt almost normal. I'd made 2 friends at the school named Jenna and Steve who didn't know my whole story, but knew enough to understand why I lived with my aunt now. My grades had climbed back up to mostly A's and B's after the rough first month. The panic attacks still happened, but less often, and I could usually manage them with the breathing techniques Dr. Sarah taught me. Jimena called to say the final custody hearing was scheduled for next month, and she felt confident about permanent placement with Aunt Linda. My mother was still with Gerald and hadn't completed any of the counseling the court recommended. I was starting to think about college applications and maybe studying psychology to help other kids stuck in situations like mine. Aunt Linda and I had gotten into a routine of cooking dinner together most nights while she told me stories about my father. She described how he used to grade papers at the kitchen table and leave encouraging notes for struggling students. How he volunteered at the library on weekends reading to little kids. My mother had never shared these details, and hearing them helped me remember him as a real person, instead of just an empty space in my life. I still carried sadness about losing my mother, and anger about the 3 years I lost to Gerald's abuse. Dr. Sarah kept reminding me that healing wasn't a straight line, and some relationships couldn't be fixed, no matter how much I wanted them to be. What mattered was that I was safe now living with someone who actually cared about my well-being. I had adults supporting me and helping me build a life where I didn't have to apologize for existing or walk on eggshells just to avoid being screamed at. The final hearing was coming, and after that I could really start moving forward.